So, welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. For today, exactly 73 years ago, May the 9th, 1950, at 6 p.m., the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundations for the European house, where today 500 million Europeans live together in peace and cooperation. Today is, therefore, Europe Day, the official birthday of the European Union, although in many member nations, it's still a best-kept secret. For this was the defining moment of post-war Europe. It launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. And there has been unprecedented peace between the EU member states ever since. Now, to draw attention to this very special day, we hold each year in the capital of the country, holding the presidency of the EU, the State of Europe Forum, where we evaluate Europe today in the light of the vision that Robert Schuman had for a community of peoples, as we just read, deeply rooted in basic Christian principles. And so we were in Stockholm. Sweden has presently the presidency of the EU. And here we were meeting on Friday night in the Santa Clara Church, which is downtown in Stockholm. And we began looking at the roots and the fruits of freedom and peace. One of our contributors was Professor Andrej Zubov, and we announced him as our guest for this month's Schuman Talk. Unfortunately, our link with him was very, very bad. He is now living in Czechia, or the Czech Republic, and we were not able to salvage the bulk of the talk that we had with him, which was going to be Schuman Talk. However, there are 5 minutes of his talk, which we are going to show you now, and which we also included in the program in Stockholm. But firstly, I want to tell you a bit more about who Professor Zubov is. He is a Russian who was born into communist Russia in an unbelieving family, but he became a believer under communism. And he's really become one of the most eminent historians in Russia. He was, after communism collapsed, he took the initiative to contact several other historians, encouraged by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, to produce a new history of Russia that was not based on the old communist ideas. There was this joke that under communist Russia, only the future was certain. The past kept changing. And of course, he therefore set out to produce a 3-volume history of Russia, which became extremely popular, very influential, and every year was republished up until 2022, when under the Putin regime, it was not the version of history that Putin wanted to tell. Professor Zubov has continued to be very brave in his speaking out against what he sees as the tyranny of the Putin regime. And let me just show you some of the postings he put on Facebook last year, where he warned the Putin regime that truth prevails over lying propaganda, and that history teaches the fate of tyrants. And he talked about geographic map mania, the mental illness affecting tyrants. And let me just read this. This is what he said openly on Facebook from Moscow. Of course, Facebook was closed down by the Putin regime, but using VPN technology, he found a way around that. They seek to push the borders of their countries to the max, ignoring the universal outrage, mocking the whole world to include their empires in their empires new provinces, departments, and lands. If the world refuses to recognize all these Anschlusses, unification and reunification, then everything usually ends very bad. He looks at Napoleon, who claimed many parts of Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Dalmatia, Greece for his empire, but that all collapsed after Waterloo. Now, Professor Zubov made himself very unpopular with the Putin regime by comparing the invasion of Crimea with Hitler's Anschluss in Austria. And so Hitler also set out to build a 1,000-year Reich with parts of France, Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Lithuania, Poland, etc., as Professor Zubov wrote in Facebook. No one except the Führer himself and his other satellites at that time recognized these manic expansions. And so now, of course, all of that was lost after the Second World War. And now the Russian authorities talk about including a number of Ukrainian regions directly into Russia. Crimea has already been turned on, next to Donbass, Kherson, and so on. Don't forget how such games ended. Shame, life sentence, bullet in the head. Maybe it's time to end this bloody game and heal from geographic map mania to look sanely at the world. Now, these are very brave words for him to be uttering. And so he goes on addressing President Putin. Detached from her native land and abandoned to foreign land, the Russian army shows inner weakness. Aggressive war on foreign soil is inconclusive for Russia. He says one thing for Russia to defend its own land, but when the Russian army is going onto other territory, it exposes its weakness, which of course is what we're observing. He says this is a statement of historical fact, not a discredit of the Russian army. And Vladimir Putin loves history. Let him scroll through her pages one more time. A wall of courage has grown up in front of the Russian army, which it will not be able to overcome. The spirit of courage and determination to stand to the end has entered the hearts of Ukrainians. Ultimately, spirit always wins, especially when there are rockets and tanks on both sides. And so he says to Putin, as a historian, to a man who loves history, I want to tell you, do not persist in a cause you have lost. Wow, that is quite something. And of course, he was he's been forced to flee the country. He was declared in last February an agent of foreign powers, and so now he continues to lecture. You can easily find him on YouTube. His lectures on overcoming the Russian tragedies, a series of lectures in English that he's given. And the question that we were asking him to answer and address to us is, what will it take to bring freedom and peace to Russia and Ukraine? Can there be peace before a Ukrainian victory? How can Russia overcome the tragedies of her past? So let's hear from Professor Zubov. You may have to listen very closely because of both the link that we had as well as his accent. And you'll see now and then the picture freezes, but he does come back. Do you see
yes.
possibility of peace without a Ukrainian victory?
Yes, of course. You see, we believe only in God. Of course, in all political events, we have not faith. It's wrong to say we believe, but I hope for the victory of Ukraine, and I see some reasons for this hope not to be pointless. I think that the support of NATO, of European Union, turn situation in this way that Putin and his regime is almost alone. Even his traditional allies, like China, were afraid to support him. openly. And Ukraine is has a great support of, as I name it, Rammstein coalition. So it's both European, non-European countries, Japan, for example, South Korea, Israel. And it's impossible even to imagine that in this situation, Ukraine Russia, the only variant is that this Rammstein coalition stopped to support Ukraine once. I think that it's impossible. And a lot of European and Rammstein politicians express their very strong opinion to continue this support. So it's impossible for Russia to win this war. The real problem is not if Ukraine wins this war or not. The real problem is what will be with Russia after Ukraine win this war, after Ukraine and all her allies win this war. What will be with Russia? See, because if Russia in its borders without any Crimea or Crimea, Donbass, everything will return to Ukraine. But if Russia continue to be an aggressive, totalitarian, military-oriented state with this communist Soviet KGB background, it will be dangerous for Europe and for all the world. And we know the history of Europe in the 20th century. After the Versailles Treaty of 1919, in 15 years, Hitler, by democratic way, took power in Germany. Yes. So new peace ought to be organized in the form which change the spirit of Russia. As Potsdam conference changed and Nuremberg process changed the spirit of Germany. Germany, with of course a lot of difficulties, I know it very well, Germany turned to be a new democratic state. And Robert Schuman was one of the engineers of this change with Konrad Adenauer, De Gasperi.
Well, that was a very clear perspective coming from a Russian, one of the most eminent historians in Russia today. Professor Zubov was with us actually in the State of Europe Forum in Riga in 2015, which was the year after the Crimean, well, he would call it Anschluss. Since we were not able to continue the interview with Professor Zubov, we're now going to go to the State of Europe Forum and hear from another professor, Evert Van de Poll, my good friend and colleague, with whom we have held annual summer schools of European studies. And we asked Avett to speak to the question of the moments of grace in recent European history. Now, this is a term that Avett has used to describe three moments: the time of Robert Schuman, the downfall of communism, and then asking, could we be observing a moment of grace unfolding now in the Ukraine, but also for many of the Slavic peoples who long to see the peace and freedom that other European peoples enjoy. This talk was also given by Avett the day before to the very first Swedish parliamentary prayer breakfast, which he and I addressed. Let's hear from Avett now.
Try to see our world from the perspective of God. Working in history, as Christians, we believe that God is not only the Lord of creation, who instituted the laws of nature that function, the regularities on which we can count. He also made the foundations of the world, which are not pillars as some primitive representations give it, but are moral pillars on which the universe is based. We believe that there is a moral law to the universe and that God has created the moral laws. We also believe that God is sovereign Lord of history and that he is leading the world towards its promised future. Now, all of that is basic theology, and we say all amen to it. But if we believe that, then we can expect God from time to time to intervene in our history and to act through his word and through people who respect his moral laws, who respect the principles of the Bible, and that God sometimes even sovereignly intervenes in a surprising way. The Bible is full of stories like that. And if we believed in those stories in the Bible, why wouldn't God go on doing things like that in our history? Now, it is very difficult to say exactly this is what God has done in the Swedish history, this is what God has done in the history of Norway, or in the history of my own person. Often the providence of God is a mystery to us. But sometimes there are moments that it is very clear to us, this is a gift, this is a moment of grace. God gives us a new opportunity of peace, a new peace, a new freedom. We didn't deserve it, but all the same we received it. And I think in the recent history of our continent, there have been such moments of grace, and the first one is the moment of grace that happened some 75 years ago. But before that, I have to say something about Europe and the name Europe, because it's very peculiar. We use that name, but where did it come from? And what did it mean? Now, it didn't mean anything in the past, and then it became a symbolic name, which you have to write in inverted commas, for a group of people who all shared the same Christian faith. And that is how the name Europe was introduced. And the name European meant being part of the Christianized world. That's how we get the idea of Europe, which is a sense of belonging to a whole that is bigger than our nation. It is not as wide as the world, but it's a particular region in the world that for a very long time has been the Christian world, and outside Christianity was a minority or didn't exist. And this has created a sense of belonging that is very deeply rooted in the European mind. And even in the last centuries, when there has been a secularization, a driving away from the church and the Christian faith, the idea of belonging to this European whole has remained. And we talk about the European civilization. We talk about the European family of cultures. And sociologists, they talk about that as a real fact. There is something about Europe that is in our minds. We feel we belong to each other as a kind of house of nations. And of course, we have been fighting each other for a very long time, but there was always this sense of we shouldn't really be fighting each other. We should live in peace together because, after all, we are part of this world called Europe. Now, this idea has never been able to give birth to the ideal of uniting all the Europeans. All the attempts have been shipwrecked. But then, after the Second World War, the time was ripe for a new approach to bring this ideal of bringing the Europeans together into practice. And 75 years ago, after the Second World War, there was a unique situation in history that was not reproduced anymore again. In the countries that had made the Second World War, Germany, France, Italy, and the other countries of Western Europe, it so happened that the key politicians were part of the same political family called the Christian democracy. Before that, that wasn't the case, and after that, Christian democracy has dwindled and become a very little minority. But at that time, they were the key movement in Europe. And these political leaders, they understood each other even when they were enemies. And that was a unique situation where you had unique leadership of leaders in France, in Italy, and also in Germany, who were able to meet on the basis of their common Christian convictions. And they decided to strive for a new order in Europe that was based on the reconciliation between enemies. Now, of course, that's a Christian concept, it's in the Bible, but it took very long to translate it into a concrete political reality. Now, how do you reconcile enemies? Now, the splendid idea was that you put their heavy industry under a common authority. And so you cannot go to war anymore except the others. You have to share the heavy industry and the coal mines and the iron mines. And this was the plan that was growing in the mind of Schuman. It was presented by Monet, and then it was presented again by Schuman. And this laid the basis of the European community of coal and steel. But this was not the final idea. The final idea was that this was a practical way to experience the fact that we are a community of people that have a shared history, have a shared moral values, and we have a shared cultural values. We are part of the same house, the house of Europe. And that was the time when it was ripe to bring into practice this idea of belonging together, not by creating an empire, but by creating a community. And in the community, people remain who they are. And that is why we have so many languages in Europe. No language has become more important than the other. All languages have the same status. It is a unity in diversity. Now, here is what Konrad Adenauer, for instance, said, one of these political leaders at that moment in time: to the fundamental principles of materialism, we must oppose the ethical principles of Christianity that should determine the construction of the state, the limitation of its powers, the rights and the duties of individuals, economic and social life, and the relation between nations and people. To the principles of materialism, we should oppose the ethical principles of Christianity. And that was the conviction shared by the leading politicians in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, and in Luxembourg, and in Germany. And they together decided to create the European community. And later other nations became part of it, the Nordic nations became part of it, and this European community has grown ever since. And the key to it was a reconciled relationship between former enemies. And I have a quote here from a German cardinal. I have to change my glasses because I don't see anything. Yeah, this is better, I think, yeah. He had this to say in a public speech: for our generation, the post-war generation, my generation, the European idea of the Europeans of the first hour, Adenauer, Schuman, de Gasperi, and many others, almost came as a redemption, as a salvation. After the bitter years of the Third Reich, Germany was again admitted as a full member of the community of European peoples. What a miracle! After the destruction of the war, a zone of peace emerged in Europe, founded on respect for the universally valid human rights and on a new awareness of the humanist and Christian roots of Europe. And Europe has become a success story. And it is a sign that things can also change for the better. if only there is the will, and I would add the reasonable wisdom to do repentance and to reconcile. Magnificent quote. And that is why I talk about a moment of grace. It is something that is given to us, a new occasion. Alcide de Gasperi, one of the other key persons, the Italian political leader and the prime minister, he had this to say: the future will not be built by force, nor by the desire to conquer. Let that be heard in Europe today. But by the patient application of the democratic method, the constructive spirit of agreement, and by respect for freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. That is how Europe will be built, or it will not be built. And so this was the moment of grace for the western part of Europe. I should say that in this change of events, the Christian democratic stream in politics, which was very strong at that moment, played a crucial role. I don't have time, and I would like to, but it is too much, but I show you this slide. What are the key values of Christian democracy? Developed in the 19th and the 20th century as an alternative to the liberal democracy, to the liberal political world, as an alternative to socialism, as an alternative to totalitarianism, Nazism and fascism and all the rest of it. And if you read the list, all of these values are inscribed in the European treaties. Now, is that coincidence, or is that perhaps the leading hand of God, who has inspired people to formulate these principles on the basis of the revelation of the Bible? All these are inscribed in the treaties of Europe, and that is where Europe got its values from. Of course, other political streams, notably Social Democrats, contributed to the construction of Europe. Christian Democrats were not the only ones. And we also see that since the 1960s, the Christian democracy has dwindled, and there's not much left of it. And at the same time, we see that the original meaning of the original project gets lost or changed. There's a great question, well, what is it really about? And so we should go back to the beginning and see, well, what was the idea in the beginning? And then came another moment of grace, very unexpected. Nobody expected it. At the end of the 1980s, Russia got a new leader, Mr. Gorbachev. At that time, he surprised the whole world. I've been part of a translation project of the biography of Gorbachev that was translated by Time magazine in 15 languages, and I did the production of the Dutch version. And that gave me an opportunity to read the story of this man, and it's completely against all odds. He should never have been elected. And all the Russian leaders, they had bad nights and bad dreams about the man whom they elected because he changed the policy. And he decided to make friends with the Western leaders, invited himself, and the Western leaders didn't know what to think about it. Is this a ploy or is it true? But it was true. It was true. Gorbachev wanted to live in the House of Europe, and he made a speech to the European Parliament and to the Council of Europe, which was a famous speech in which he explained to the parliamentarians what is the House of Europe. And hearing that from a communist leader of Moscow, that was the biggest surprise. I've lived that surprise. And then all of a sudden, popular movements arose in all the Eastern European and Central European countries, non-violent, hardly any gunshots, hardly any casualties. And what did the Kremlin do? Gorbachev decided not to intervene. And when the popular movement pushed to go to the West and wanted to get to West Berlin, the Kremlin decided not to be present. And Gorbachev went to his dacha and he let the thing go. And then the Eastern Germans and the Western Germans, they met each other on the Berlin Wall, and they decided to break it down. The wall did not fall, it was broken down by human hands. And then all the Soviet regimes, one after the other, fell. So much so that all the members of the Soviet Union, they left the Union, and Gorbachev himself was left without a job at the end of his life, because there was no more Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, Central and Eastern Europe had the opportunity to create a new order based on democracy, based on freedom, and based on open borders. We were so surprised that it happened. And even Russia wanted to be part of this new Europe. What we often forget is the spiritual factor. That is the next slide. There were banners in Eastern Germany after what they call the Wende, the turn, the U-turn. Danke, Kirche. Thank you, church. And people put it on the windows, people put it on the streets. Thank you, church. And that makes us aware of the fact that the church, that was having a hard time in the West, losing members, losing influence, was the key player in the changes in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe. We have the Polish Pope, John Paul II, who invited himself to Eastern Europe. He was not invited, he invited himself, with the simple message, fear not. And everybody in Ukraine understood what that meant. Everybody in Belarus understood what that meant. Fear not. And it gave them the courage to resist and to protest against the system. Solidarność, the trade union in Poland, a free trade union, not ruled by the state, not ruled by the Communist Party, but linked to the Roman Catholic Church, blessed by the hierarchy. And then in Leipzig, a church very much like this church, where there were weekly prayer meetings. And during the prayer meetings, people had the freedom to say what they wanted to say. And they had the courage to say it. And then they said it within the church after the prayers. And then all of a sudden, one night, they went into the street to say what they wanted to say. And more people were added. And every week there were more people, and more people, and more people. And it became a massive movement all over Eastern Germany. And that led even to a movement in Berlin. And that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Then there was a reformed pastor in the western part of Romania, the Hungarian part of Romania, Timișoara, who was courageously opposing the government and the system. And he preached clearly about justice and about freedom. And he was arrested. And then the people of his church, they protested in front of the authorities. They wanted their pastor back. And so the authorities gave them the pastor back. But the next week he was arrested again, and then he gave them back. And that went on for week and week and week. And the movement outside the church grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And it became a national movement. And within weeks, Ceausescu had to flee from his big palace. In the West, I was part of an initiative. We were praying in the West under the initiative of Open Doors. It was called 7 Years of Prayer for a Change in the Communist Bloc. They started, I think, in 82 or 83. It turned out to be prophetic because about 7 years later, the whole thing crumbled down. And so there is this spiritual factor that is not often put forward, but that makes me say it was a moment of grace. And because of this important role churches played, we see that people in Central and Eastern Europe are very much attached to their Christian roots, to their Christian background, to the disgust of their Western European colleagues who meet them now in the European Parliament and in the European Commission, and they don't like at all what Polish and Hungarian and Slovakian and Croatian deputies are saying about the Christian faith. But for them, it was the basis of resisting the totalitarian system. So they are attached to that. And I'm so happy that Central and Eastern European countries are now in the European Union to give a counterbalance against the secularizing tendencies of the Western countries. And when they get in conflict over family issues, I'm just so happy that it happens, because somebody has to say it. And so we invited all these Eastern Europeans to come in, but also we have to listen to them. And so to finish this short presentation, I'm thinking of today. And we have seen the Ukrainian kids that reminded me of my visits to Ukraine, which is a very pleasant country, but it is a country that is based on the dividing line between Orthodox and Catholic Europe. And there's a war, it's about language, it's about territory, it's about freedom. It is an empire versus a community of peoples. And there is an ideology behind the Russian regime that is called Eurasianism, which means that the eastern part of Europe does not belong to the western part, but does belong to Asia. Now this is a horrific ideology that is ripping apart the eastern part of Europe. Russia belongs to Europe. Russia belongs to Europe. When I give a concert, I give piano recitals, I deliberately play Russian music. We don't want the Russians out. We are not anti-Russian. And sooner or later, the brother nations, Ukrainians and Russians, will have to decide to reconcile, otherwise they will kill each other to death. And we have the example of France and Germany, who had enormous rounds of wars, but sooner or later, there is no other choice than to reconcile. And that's the only way Europe can advance and be built as a community of people. Today, it is too early, I think, for talking about reconciliation. There are forces of violence and destruction that have to be exhausted first. Like the Nazi forces, they had to be defeated before you could talk with the German people about reconciliation. So we don't have to go too quickly. It is a difficult time, and we don't know what will happen this year and next year. But in the long run, we can hope and we can pray for a new moment of grace that will bring the Eastern European peoples that are now fighting each other together, as we in the West have been given this grace of living together in harmony and peace after so many ages of war. And given the fact that this has happened in the recent past, why not pray for and hope for another moment of grace to come? Thank you.
Well, I hope you were encouraged by this perspective of recognizing God's hand even in contemporary history and giving us faith, hope, and vision for the future and what to pray for concerning the future not only of Ukraine, but of Russia, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and so on. One of the people who also addressed us in Stockholm was the former EU envoy on freedom of religion outside of Europe. His name is Jan Feigel. He comes from Slovakia. In fact, he led the process of membership application of Slovakia and later was appointed as in this envoy role. And I heard him speak at the European Prayer Breakfast last December. And he said, you know, everybody loves apples, but we only have apples because there are trees with roots. And everybody loves freedom and peace, but we don't often recognize that we need to recognize what the roots of freedom and peace are. And this is how he addresses us.
Freedom and peace are very important human values. Like all real values, they require certain ongoing effort, vigilance, and our responsibility. Freedom and peace have their roots. They are rooted in virtues of truth and justice. Tasteful apples are fruits of a sound tree with vital, living and feeding roots. These invisible roots remain underground, but for the visible and healthy fruits, They are indispensable. And it all starts with a small seed and then a young, fragile plant of a little tree. Therefore, desire for healthy fruits presuppose our care about roots and tree as well. Similarly, freedom and peace are very needed and important fruits of truth and justice. Freedom is a very popular phenomenon, but we should remember that freedom is a beautiful but vulnerable daughter of a wise and brave mother called truth. Because truth liberates us from illusions, lies, propaganda, or demagogy. Truth reveals that we all are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Respect of fundamental human rights of all is a core of modern justice. But we should remember that rights are possible only in connection with duties and obligations. Human dignity is a source, foundational principle of my rights and my duties as well. I can claim my rights, but I must remember also my duties as husband, as father, citizen, towards the other and towards community I live in, starting with my family. Peace is a fruit of justice. Therefore, if we desire a peace in 21st century, we must do more for justice in our society and among nations. Roots of truth and justice are represented by dignity of each human person with his or her inalienable and universal rights. Culture of human dignity for all requires respect and implementation of two ancient and justified ethical principles: silver ethical principle and the golden one. Silver ethical principle says, don't do unto others what you don't want others to do unto you. And golden ethical principle invites us in a positive way, do unto others what you want others to do unto you. These principles confirm equal dignity and promote justice for all. When culture of human dignity prevails, we may enjoy its good and tasteful fruits, freedom and peace for all.
Jan Feigel is our guest for June's Schuman Talk. And he grew up under communism. He lost his uncle, who had the same name, to the violence of the communists. His family never knew where his uncle, Jan Feigel, was buried. And so we asked him, what was it like to live under communism without the freedom, without the peace? And what role did his Christian faith play in his story? And what inspiration did he draw from the Robert Schuman story? So we look forward to hearing more from Jan Feigel next month, and we invite you to join us June the 9th, 6 p.m. Thank you.